The day the sky burned. The city of Lagos had never been quiet, but on the morning the Vryn arrived, silence fell like a guillotine blade. Market vendors froze mid-haggle, their eyes drawn skyward where geometric shapes, massive, crystalline, impossible, descended through the clouds. The ships didn't roar or rumble. They hummed, a frequency that made teeth ache and bones vibrate, as if the universe itself was being retuned. Amara Okonkwo had been changing the oil in a rusted taxi when the first pulse hit. The electromagnetic wave swept across the continent, killing power grids, silencing phones, turning vehicles into elaborate paperweights. She dropped her wrench and staggered into the street, shielding her eyes against the alien vessels that now dominated the horizon. They were beautiful in a terrible way, faceted surfaces catching sunlight, refracting it into colors that shouldn't exist. Then they opened fire. The beams weren't fire or plasma or anything recognizable. They were erasure, pure and simple. Buildings touched by that light simply ceased to exist along with everyone inside them. No explosion, no rubble, just empty space where moments before there had been life and laughter and arguments about football scores. Amara ran, her mechanic's instincts screaming at her to find cover, to think, to survive across the Atlantic. In a cramped Brooklyn apartment, Marcus Chen was 3 lines of code away from fixing a bug when his screens went dark. The programmer's first thought was a blown fuse. His second, as he heard screaming from the street below, was that the world had finally gone mad. He pressed his face against the window and saw them, triangular craft hovering above Manhattan, their undersides glowing with that wrong light. A beam lanced down, and the office building across the street vanished like it had been photoshopped out of existence. Marcus grabbed his laptop bag out of pure instinct, then laughed bitterly at himself. No power meant no computers, no internet, no digital anything, but old habits died hard, and something in his gut told him that surviving would require every tool, every skill, every scrap of knowledge humanity possessed. In rural Wyoming, former Marine Sarah Kowalski heard the explosions before she saw the ships. Her ranch sat 40 miles from the nearest town, isolated by choice and necessity. She'd come home from Afghanistan with too many scars, visible and otherwise seeking silence. Now that silence was being shattered by something far worse than anything she'd faced overseas. Sarah moved on autopilot, years of training overriding panic. She grabbed her rifle, ammunition, the emergency radio that had been her grandfather's. The radio crackled with fragments of broadcasts, voices overlapping in a dozen languages, all saying the same thing. Earth was under attack. Targets were major cities, military installations, communication hubs. The strikes were coordinated, precise, methodical. The aliens weren't here to negotiate. They were here to cleanse. The Vryn had chosen Earth for its resources and its location, a strategic point in a galactic sector they'd been expanding into for 3 centuries. Preliminary scans had shown a Type 0 civilization, primitive, fractious, barely capable of leaving their own planet. The dominant species showed promise as a labor force once properly subjugated. Resistance was calculated at 14% probability, projected duration of less than 1 planetary rotation. Fleet Commander Zekthor reviewed the invasion parameters with satisfaction. His species had conquered 47 worlds using this exact protocol. The electromagnetic pulse had crippled their infrastructure. The demonstration strikes would break their will. Within days, the survivors would surrender, and the Vryn would begin exploitation operations. What Zekthor and his analysts failed to account for was that humans didn't calculate surrender probability. They calculated spite. Amara found herself in an abandoned warehouse with 11 other survivors, a mix of civilians who'd had the luck or instinct to avoid the initial strikes. Among them was a teenager named Kahinda who'd been studying engineering, an elderly woman named Mrs. Adalik who ran a textile shop, and a former police officer named Chukwu who'd lost his family in the first attack. "We need weapons," Chukwu said, his voice hollow. "We need to fight back." "With what?" someone asked. "They killed the power. Our guns work, but what are bullets against ships like that?" Amara knelt beside a burned-out transformer, running her fingers across melted copper. "Everything runs on electricity or mechanics," she said slowly, her mechanic's mind turning over the problem. "Their ships use some kind of power source. Their weapons need energy. Physics still applies even to aliens. Kahinda crouched beside her, eyes bright despite the ash on his face. You're thinking we can reverse engineer their technology? I'm thinking we can improvise. Amara pulled a piece of intact circuitry from the transformer. We can't match their tech, but we don't need to. We need to be unpredictable. Humans are good at that. Across the world, similar conversations were happening. In Seoul and Sao Paulo and Cairo and Melbourne and Moscow, survivors were gathering, grieving, and then, inevitably, getting angry. The Vryn had made their first mistake. They'd left witnesses. Humans who'd seen their families erased, their cities burned, their world violated. The Vryn had broken humanity's toys and expected submission. What they got was improvisation. Marcus found himself leading a group of survivors through the subway tunnels beneath Manhattan, using the darkness and the aliens' apparent discomfort with underground spaces to stay hidden. Among his group was a former electrical engineer named Patricia, a chef named David, who knew the tunnel systems from his delivery days, and a medical student named Yuki whose hands shook but whose voice stayed steady as she treated the wounded. They're scanning surface structures, Patricia said, examining a piece of alien debris they'd recovered from a crashed scout drone. But they're not penetrating deep underground. Maybe their sensors can't handle dense material. Or maybe they just don't think we're smart enough to use the tunnels strategically. Then that's our advantage, Marcus said. We stay below, we watch, we learn their patterns, and we hit them when they're not expecting it. Sarah's ranch became an unexpected gathering point for survivors from 3 counties. Her military background and isolated location made her a natural leader for people desperate for direction. She organized watches, rationed supplies, and began training civilians in basic combat tactics. But Sarah knew bullets wouldn't be enough. As she watched alien patrol craft sweep across the horizon, she remembered something her gunnery sergeant had told her in Kandahar. The enemy always has better equipment. Your job is to be meaner, smarter, and more creative about violence than they are. Humans, Sarah thought grimly, had thousands of years of experience being creative about violence. On the 3rd day of the invasion, the Vryn began to notice anomalies. Patrols that should have encountered cowering survivors instead triggered improvised explosives. Power signatures they expected from human settlements flickered in unexpected patterns, suggesting hidden activity. And most disturbing, several scout drones had gone offline in areas that should have been pacified. Fleet Commander Zekthor studied the reports with growing unease. The humans' resistance should have collapsed by now. Instead, it was adapting, evolving, becoming coordinated despite the loss of their communication networks. He didn't yet understand that humans had spent millennia passing information through whispers and runners, through smoke signals and drumbeats. The Vryn had destroyed humanity's convenience, not its capability. The war, Zekthor realized too late, was just beginning, and humanity was writing a new rule into the galactic consciousness. Never corner something clever enough to be dangerous and angry enough, not to care about the odds. The Vryn had come to conquer Earth. They were about to learn what happens when you give humanity nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The human equation. The Vryn occupation entered its 3rd week with Fleet Commander Zekthor's confidence eroding like coastline under a hurricane. His tactical displays showed something impossible. The human resistance wasn't weakening. It was metastasizing. In Lagos, Amara's warehouse had transformed into something between a workshop and a war room. Scavenged Vryn technology covered every surface, circuit boards torn from downed drones, power cells extracted from damaged patrol craft. She worked, by candlelight and intuition, her hands grease-stained, her mind racing through problems no human should have been able to solve. The power cells use a crystalline matrix, she explained to Kahinda, who'd become her de facto assistant. I can't replicate it, but I can destabilize it. Make it release all its energy at once, instead of gradually. You're making bombs from their own power sources, the teenager said, understanding lighting his face. Bombs they can't detect as human technology because it's not. Amara's grin was feral. Their sensors are calibrated for their own tech signatures. They'll register these as malfunctions, not weapons. Mrs. Adalek had repurposed her textile, skills in ways that would have horrified her grandchildren. She wove camouflage netting threaded with fragments of Vryn hull material. creating coverings that confused alien sensors. Chukwu used his knowledge of the city to plan ambush routes, turning Lagos's chaotic streets into a three-dimensional maze where every alley might hide a trap. The Vryn learned that humans didn't fight fair. They learned it when 3 patrol craft disappeared into what appeared to be empty buildings, only to be torn apart by improvised explosives triggered by tripwires made from dental floss and fishing line. They learned it when scouts reported entire city blocks that seemed abandoned, only to have snipers fire from positions that shouldn't have been accessible. In New York's subway tunnels, Marcus had created something unprecedented, a functional communication network using salvaged electronics, modified Vryn signal boosters, and pure desperation. It was slow, clunky, capable of transmitting only text, but it worked. Suddenly, resistance cells across the city could coordinate, share intelligence, warn each other of patrols. Patricia had reverse-engineered enough of the Vryn scanning technology to build crude detectors. They pulse every 7.3 seconds, she told the group clustered around her makeshift workbench. We get a warning about 20 seconds before they're in scan range. Enough time to hide or retreat. How long until they change the frequency? Yuki asked, practical despite her exhaustion. Days, maybe hours. But we'll adapt again. Marcus's eyes were red-rimmed from staring at screens powered by jury-rigged generators. That's what they don't understand about us. We're really, really good at making things work that shouldn't. David had weaponized his knowledge of the city's underground in ways the Vryn couldn't anticipate. He led raids through maintenance tunnels, emerging behind alien positions, hitting supply depots and falling back before reinforcements arrived. The aliens had shields, advanced weapons, tactical superiority. But they didn't know the territory, and they moved like they expected resistance to follow military logic. Humans, it turned out, were enthusiastically illogical when provoked. Sarah's Wyoming compound had become a training center, and a proving ground for tactics that would have gotten her court-martialed in the Marines. She taught civilians to think like guerrillas, to use the terrain, to treat every engagement as a chance to steal equipment and disappear. They expect us to hold ground, she told her ragtag militia. So we don't. We hit them, take what we can and vanish. Make them paranoid. Make them waste resources on security. Death by 1,000 cuts. Among her students was a 16-year-old named Jake who'd lost his entire family in the first strike. He'd arrived at the compound with nothing but rage and a pocket knife. Now he was one of her best scouts, able to move through grassland and forest like smoke, getting close enough to alien positions to count their numbers and map their equipment. They're creatures of pattern, Jake reported after one reconnaissance run. They patrol on schedule, they respond to threats the same way every time, they trust their technology completely. Then we break their patterns, Sarah said. We make them afraid to trust their sensors, their protocols, their assumptions. We become the chaos in their ordered invasion. The Vryn military doctrine had evolved over centuries of conquest. It was precise, efficient, based on statistical analysis and overwhelming force. Every contingency had a protocol, every resistance pattern a counter-strategy. But their databases contained no reference for an enemy that treated physics as a suggestion and tactics as improv comedy with lethal consequences. Fleet Commander Zekthor watched his casualty reports climb with mounting horror. Humans were using primitive chemical explosives that shouldn't have been able to penetrate Vryn shielding, except they weren't targeting the shields directly. They collapsed buildings onto patrol craft. They flooded subway tunnels where scouts were pursuing them. They used the aliens' own power cells against them in ways Vryn engineers hadn't imagined possible because no rational species would attempt something so dangerous and stupid. But humans, Zekthor was learning, excelled at dangerous and stupid when sufficiently motivated. The turning point came on day 19. A coordinated series of attacks across 15 cities simultaneously destroyed Vryn communication relays. Using a weakness Patricia had discovered and Marcus had distributed through the growing underground network. For 6 hours, the invasion force was blind, unable to coordinate responses. In those 6 hours, human resistance cells struck like piranhas, stealing supplies, rescuing prisoners from collection centers, destroying landing craft, and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. When the Vryn restored their communications, They'd lost 23% of their ground forces and 40% of their surveillance capability. More importantly, they'd lost their psychological advantage. The humans weren't cowering. They were learning, adapting, and counterattacking with increasing sophistication. In Lagos, Amara stood on a rooftop as dawn broke, watching alien ships retreat from the city center to more defensible positions. Kehinde stood beside her, holding one of their improvised weapons, a Vrin power cell wired to a proximity sensor, deadly in its elegant simplicity. "We're not winning," Kehinde said quietly. "Not yet," Amara agreed. "But we're not losing either. And every day we survive, we get smarter, faster, meaner." She thought about the network forming across Earth. Resistance cells sharing knowledge, tactics, hope. The Vrin had the technology, but humans had something more valuable. They had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. In New York, Marcus sent out another broadcast through the makeshift network. "Day 19. Still here, still fighting. Pass it on." Simple words, but they rippled through the tunnels, the hiding places, the scattered groups of survivors. A reminder that humanity wasn't extinct, wasn't broken, wasn't finished. In Wyoming, Sarah watched her militia practice ambush drills and felt something she hadn't felt since Kandahar: pride. These weren't soldiers. They were teachers and farmers and kids who should have been worrying about college applications. But they were learning to fight with a creativity born of desperation and a refusal to accept extinction as inevitable. And across the galaxy, other species watching the invasion began to take notice. The Vrin were an established power, their conquests legendary. Yet this primitive species on a backwater planet was fighting them to a standstill using improvisation and audacity. In star systems light years away, alien analysts began updating their files on humanity. The designation changed from negligible threat to unpredictable variable to, finally, something that made several species very nervous: adaptive aggressive intelligence. The humans hadn't just survived the first wave. They'd turned the invasion into a war of attrition the Vrin couldn't win, because humans were willing to try things that shouldn't work, trust instincts over data, and fight with a cheerful disregard for proper military protocol. The Vrin had made their biggest mistake. They'd assumed humanity would respond rationally to an unwinnable situation. They'd forgotten to check whether humans cared about winning according to someone else's rules. Humanity's checkmate. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once, the way avalanches build from single pebbles, the way revolutions ignite from whispered words. By day 30, the Vrin invasion had become something Fleet Commander Zekthor's tactical computers couldn't model. A stalemate that favored the species that thrived on improvisation. Amara had stopped sleeping more than 2 hours at a time. Her warehouse had become a hub for 3 linked resistance cells, coordinating operations across West Africa. The latest acquisition sat on her workbench, a nearly intact Vrin combat drone they'd captured by literally dropping a net on it and shorting its systems with seawater. She'd been reverse engineering it for 6 days, and what she'd found made her laugh with bitter triumph. "Their AI is brilliant," she told the assembled group, "but it follows rigid decision trees. It can't conceive of solutions outside its programming parameters. Watch." She activated the drone in a containment cage. It immediately began scanning for threats, its weapons systems powering up. Amara held up a mirror, just ordinary glass and silver, reflecting the drone's own sensor beam back at itself. The machine froze, trapped in a recognition loop, unable to classify its own signature as threat or ally. "Humans don't freeze," Kehinde said softly. "We guess, we improvise. We do stupid things that work because no one told us they couldn't." Mrs. Adalek had developed something the resistance was calling ghost cloth and fabric woven with Vrin hull fragments and coated with a paste made from local plants that somehow disrupted their sensors. Scouts wearing it could walk within meters of alien patrols undetected. The chemistry didn't make sense by Vrin or human standards, but it worked. And that was enough. Chukwu coordinated strikes with a precision that would have impressed any military commander, using runners and hand signals because they'd learned the aliens could intercept radio communications. but couldn't decode human idioms and slang. Green mango meant attack now. The rain is late meant abort and scatter. Every cell developed their own code, every city its own language of resistance. In Manhattan, Marcus had accomplished something impossible. He'd hacked a Vrin tactical database. It had taken Patricia's hardware expertise, his programming knowledge, and an absurd amount of trial and error that nearly got them killed twice. But now they could see enemy fleet positions, supply routes, command structures. "They're overstretched," Patricia said, studying the data with a strategist's eye. They committed 70% of their invasion force to the initial strikes, expecting quick surrender. "They don't have enough ships to maintain their perimeter and control the cities. So we make them choose," Marcus said. "We hit their supply lines, force them to pull back from cities to protect their infrastructure. We turn their strength, their dependence on technology and supply chains, into a weakness." David had evolved from guide to guerrilla commander, leading raids that stole not just supplies but intelligence, prisoners, and alien equipment. Every captured Vrin soldier was interrogated, not through torture but through confusion. Humans asked questions that didn't follow logical patterns, made references the aliens couldn't parse, displayed emotional ranges that their psychology couldn't predict. One captured Vrin officer, after 3 days of exposure to human interrogation, which mostly involved bad jokes, philosophical debates, and forced viewing of Earth action movies, had suffered what the resistance medics diagnosed as an existential crisis. The alien kept repeating, you should not still be fighting. The mathematics says you should not still be fighting." Yuki, tending to the alien's injuries with the same care she'd give a human, replied, "We're really bad at math." In Wyoming, Sarah's compound had become something unprecedented. A human military academy teaching tactics the Vrin couldn't counter because they weren't tactics at all. They were jazz. Improvisation with deadly intent. Her students learned to read the landscape, use psychology against enemies who thought they'd accounted for psychological warfare, and most importantly, to trust their instincts over their fears. Jake had proven to be naturally gifted at what Sarah called alien psychology without actually understanding aliens. He could predict Vrin movements not through analysis but through intuition, reading patterns in their behavior the way ancient hunters read animal tracks. "They're getting scared," Jake reported after a reconnaissance mission. "I watched a patrol abandon a sweep because they heard a noise they couldn't identify. Just whined through a drainage pipe, but they retreated rather than investigate. We've made them paranoid," Sarah said with satisfaction. "They came here expecting to scare us. We've reversed the script." The Resistance had discovered something the Vrin couldn't have anticipated. Humans were apex predators not because of strength, but because of persistence and creativity. They were pack hunters who coordinated through intuition as much as communication, who learned from every failure, who turned every disadvantage into a potential weapon. On day 42, the Global Resistance launched Operation Absurdity, a coordinated attack so chaotic and illogical that the Vrin tactical computers literally crashed trying to model it. In Lagos, resistance fighters used homemade gliders to drop improvised explosives on ships from above. In New York, they flooded subway tunnels to force aliens into narrow corridors, where technology couldn't compensate for numbers. In Wyoming, they stampeded cattle through alien positions using firecrackers and folk music. Individually, each tactic was ridiculous. Collectively, they created a situation Vrin military doctrine had no response for. The complete breakdown of battlefield coherence. Aliens trained to fight in organized campaigns found themselves facing enemy forces that treated war like extreme sports, mixed with practical jokes. The cattle stampede shouldn't have worked. The gliders shouldn't have penetrated alien air defenses. The flooded tunnels should have been a tactical dead end. But humans didn't fight based on what should work. They fought based on what might work, and they were willing to try anything once. Fleet Commander Zekthor watched his invasion collapse in real time. The humans had reversed every advantage. His superior technology became something they captured and repurposed. His communication networks became something they infiltrated and confused with. References to memes and rickrolling. His organized military machine faced an enemy that treated chaos as a strategic asset. On day 50, Zekthor received the transmission that ended the invasion. It came not from his superiors but from the Galactic Council, a multi-species organization that monitored interstellar conflicts. The message was simple and devastating. Immediate withdrawal from Earth mandated. Species designation upgraded to protected developing civilization. Hostile action against humanity prohibited under Council law pending formal contact protocols. The Vryn had lost, not because they were defeated militarily, but because they'd proven the galactic community's worst fear, that humans, if pushed to extinction, would fight with enough creativity and ferocity to destabilize an entire sector. Several Council species had been watching the invasion with growing alarm, seeing in humanity's response a mirror of their own evolutionary past, the same dangerous cleverness that had made them apex species. On their own worlds, humans didn't have the technology to threaten galactic civilization, but they had something potentially more dangerous, the ability to innovate under pressure, to refuse extinction, to turn physics and probability into negotiable suggestions rather than laws. As Vryn ships lifted from Earth's atmosphere, Amara stood on her Lagos rooftop watching them go. Kehinde stood beside her, both of them filthy, exhausted, alive. "We won," the teenager said, disbelief in his voice. "We survived," Amara corrected. "We showed them that humanity doesn't calculate odds before fighting. We just fight." In New York, Marcus broadcast the final message through the Resistance Network. Day 50, alien ships withdrawing. We did it. Every improvised weapon, every crazy plan, every refusal to surrender, it mattered. Humanity endures. In Wyoming, Sarah gathered her militia and told them something her gunnery sergeant had said, words that now felt prophetic. The enemy always has better equipment, but we're meaner, smarter, and more creative about violence than they'll ever be. Earth had survived first contact with hostile aliens, not through superior firepower, but through superior stubbornness. The Vryn had approached humanity as a math problem and discovered too late that humans were the equation that solved itself through sheer, bloody-minded refusal to accept calculated defeat. In star systems across the galaxy, the diplomatic community began preparing for what everyone knew was inevitable. Humanity would reach the stars eventually, and when they did, they'd bring their chaos, creativity, and dangerous cleverness with them. The Vryn had made the biggest mistake any species could make. They'd taught humanity that even technologically superior aliens could be beaten through improvisation, adaptation, and audacity. They'd turned Earth into the galaxy's most elaborate object lesson. Never corner something clever enough to be dangerous, creative enough to innovate under pressure, and absolutely too stubborn to know when it's beaten.